Okay, good morning. Let's officially get started. I'm Leandra Lederman, the William W. Oliver Professor of Tax Law at Indiana University Maurer School of Law. And I'm really pleased to see everyone here today and to be able to welcome Professor Nyamagaga Gondwe presenting her really interesting paper. So let me go ahead and give a short bio, and then she will speak for about 20 to 30 minutes, and then we'll have Q&A. Professor Nyamagaga Gondwe is an assistant professor of tax law at the University of Wisconsin Law School, where she teaches Tax 1, federal income taxation, and Tax 2, business taxation. Prior to her appointment at Wisconsin, she was a visiting assistant professor of tax law at NYU School of Law from 2020 to 2022. She received her AB in African American Studies and Linguistics from Harvard College and her JD from Yale Law School in 2018, where she was an editor on the Yale Law Journal. After completing her JD, Professor Gondwe clerked for the Honorable Jeffrey A. Maurer at the United States District Court for the District of Connecticut, and she worked as a tax associate at Skadden Arps, Slate, Meagher, and Flom in Washington, D.C., and today she's presenting her very interesting paper titled Emergency Exit. So with that, Gaga, please take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Leandra. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right, so thank you all for joining us today. My project that you are joining me on, Emergency Exit, is in its nascent stages. So you're joining me at, I think, what is the most exciting point in a project. And I really look forward to your feedback and the conversation that we'll have after my presentation. Let's see. So the project is called Emergency Exit, and just as a brief kind of overview of how we're going to proceed from here, first we're going to discuss the sort of central problem that I'm hoping to address through this paper, which is that the current landscape of responses, policy responses to intimate partner violence are framed through a too narrow lens. So my framing for the paper, which kind of focuses on how IPV policy should shift from a framework of individual accountability, focusing on sort of the perpetrators and on like the victims kind of lifting themselves out of their circumstances, to one that places IPV in the context of systemic inequality and attempts to address it through that lens. My thesis is that financial policy can improve women's economic autonomy in a way that makes a difference for women's experiences of intimate partner violence. And my proposal is that reforming certain features in tax policy can improve women's independent economic security from cradle to grave. So this is the overall the roadmap for what we're going to be going through. And just before I kind of get into everything, I'm going to start with a story. So the paper is called Emergency Exit, and what I envision when I titled it this was the idea that anytime you like go into a movie theater and you're sitting there before the movie even starts, you sort of learn all of the ways that all of the sort of exit points in the room that make it that in the case of like a fire or other kind of emergency, right? So there is a protocol for that everybody kind of understands about how to leave if there is something bad happening in the room. And so I think of this in the context of domestic violence, because as it stands right now, domestic violence policy in the United States is very scattered, very decentralized, and very difficult to navigate if you are a person who is experiencing trauma and needs to exit the situation that you're in, or like on an urgent basis. So I started thinking about sort of money and relationships at actually quite a young age. So I was in church around 13 years old when an older church member came up to me, and we were talking a little bit about relationships, and she was like, anytime you get into a relationship, make sure that you have get out money. And get out money is what I think is knowledge that is passed down from among women in that setting. That is a secret stash of cash that a woman should have that her partner does not know about, that will allow her to leave the relationship in a hurry, right? And so at starting, from, I think I was a teenager, starting from that age, I understood that there is an important financial independence feature to being in a relationship that is not something that is very often talked about in policy. So this paper is about taking sort of this concept of get out money and taking the urgency of intimate partner violence and bringing it into the world of policy in a way that hasn't really been, I guess, explored on the legal side as much as it's been explored through papers on public health and wellness. So the scope of federal IPV policy now, I'm going to focus on the legislation through the Violence Against Women Act, which was reauthorized in March 2022. And the 2022 reauthorization defines economic abuse for the first time as a form of domestic violence. And it does this in order to allow any organizations that are seeking grant funding that focus on economic abuse to be able to access that funding through VAWA. So the legislation encoded at 34 USC 12291 says the term economic abuse in the context of domestic violence, dating violence, and abuse later in life means behavior that is coercive, deceptive, or unreasonably controls or restrains a person's ability to acquire, use, or maintain economic resources to which they are entitled, including using coercion, fraud, or manipulation, to restrict a person's access to money, to unfairly use a person's personal economic resources, or to exert undue influence over a person's financial and economic behavior or decisions. And so when you're looking at the concept of economic abuse and you think of the legislation of VAWA, which is predominantly encoded in the part of the US code that deals with criminal acts, you can't really look at economic abuse and say like there is a remedy in criminal law. There would be there could be prosecution related to the kinds of things that encompass economic abuse. So there has to be a different approach to addressing it than what currently exists. And so within the VAWA reauthorization, the Congress kind of cites a study that says one of the best predictors of whether a survivor will be able to stay away from his or her abuser is the degree of his or her economic independence. They say, however, domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking often negatively impact a survivor's ability to maintain employment. So this brings us to one of the sort of general themes of this legislation, is this idea that the concept of economic independence would be facilitated through employment, even though the same legislation says that women often also experience sexual violence in the context of work. So employment doesn't seem to be the correct lens to be working through either. So there are many statistics that are cited in the act. So 60% of single women lack economic security, 81% of households with single mothers live in economic insecurity, 92% of homeless women have experienced domestic violence, more than 50% of homeless women cite domestic violence as a direct cause for their homelessness, and in general, survivors are deprived of their autonomy, liberty, and security and face tremendous threats to their health and safety. So looking at the sort of, I guess, a broad strokes attempt to frame how violence against women is addressed through VAWA and as intimate partner violence legislation, there's sort of two kind of schemes. There's the carceral interventions that are supported through the legislation. So training for police departments that are interacting with people who are experiencing intimate partner violence, funding for victim advocate positions in police departments, and funding for intimate partner violence education programs in communities. And then on the other side, right, VAWA's authority, VAWA gives grant making authority to the DOJ to give funding to organizations that support people who are experiencing intimate partner violence. So there's grant support for both state and local governments and nonprofit IPV intervention efforts, support for employers to address workplace IPV, and also training for TANF administrators who are encountering survivors. So the framework of VAWA sort of focuses on the different kinds of interveners who will encounter people who are experiencing intimate partner violence. And part of the problem is that the policy framework right now doesn't actually create a direct access or I guess a direct intervention from federal policy to women experiencing intimate partner violence. So for example, this supporting carceral intervention is very perpetrator focused. It says we're going to lock up the person committing the intimate partner violence. It is a very focus on individual accountability. Look at this person and the bad things that they have done. And it discounts also the role of police as a source of violence against women and poor people in POC communities. And so that is something that is inadequately addressed when legislation kind of focuses on carceral interventions. On the other side, we have the outside organization funding, which is very decentralized and difficult to navigate during periods of high stress. It's full of layers of bureaucracy that that are between victims and resources, and there is an uneven dispersion of resources among recipient organizations. It's just difficult to know which organizations have how much funding and whether or not they'll be able to serve the people in need in their communities. So like I said, the fact that there's no direct response to the needs of women in this policy framework is a significant problem, and one that I think is sort of a recurring theme in I guess financial assistance policy for people who need government assistance. So there's also this kind of weird moralizing language in VAWA, and that has to do with creating like a virtue, I guess, with framing the sort of virtues of certain features of a person's life, right? So there's language in this in the Reauthorization Act that would kind of identify tacit policy objectives. It doesn't like specifically say this is what we're trying to do, but it does kind of allude to these things as important to the project of addressing IPV. So there's like the virtue of marriage. There are unexplained discussions about the economic security of single mothers, including the statistics I cited earlier. Those statistics are not placed in any sort of context. It just the bill just kind of goes into this discussion about single mothers without any sort of preamble. And that kind of points to this idea that marriage is a source of economic security for women, despite the like sort of evidence that women in marriages have individually face higher sort of lower economic outcomes than unmarried women. Then there's also like the virtue of employment. So in the bill, there's a discussion of measuring the harm of IPV by the IPV related homicide as the leading causes of death for women on the job. Aggregate days of paid work that IPV victims have lost, which is about 8 million, the value of survivors' lost productivity due to IPV, and also they looked at reports by company executives about how domestic violence negatively impacts company productivity. So these two sort of underlying themes sort of speak to that individual accountability. On the one hand, we criminalize perpetrators and say we're going to put them in prison because they're antisocial. We don't want them in our communities. But on the other hand, we say, victims or people who have access to employment and who are married will have the economic security that could help save them from this experience. So the framing of this paper is going to be about shifting the lens from that individual accountability to from intimate partner violence as a set of discrete interpersonal disputes to intimate partner violence as a reflection of a system that condones using violence as a tool to maintain structural hierarchies. So you can envision IPV through the lens of settler colonialism, white supremacy, patriarchy, and capitalism, which are all systems that use violence to establish and maintain control over people and resources. Just to give sort of one example, you could think of the riots in Tulsa, Oklahoma that decimated a Black community. That was just starting to be on the rise. So you see a community of people in Oklahoma who have been economically depressed for a long time, just starting to rise up. And then all of a sudden, the work that they have put into sort of self-assistance is destroyed with no remedy, right? It's just gone. And so you kind of see this like sort of recurring theme of using economic dependence and economic hierarchy to maintain all of these different kinds of structures. So IPV sort of in context should be like thought of as a set of tools that are used to control one partner's movements, actions, and access to resources. So physical violence is just one of the set of tools. It is not the overarching objective of IPV. So physical violence, emotional harm, economic abuse, sociocultural pressures, and psychological harm all form sort of like the set of tools that encompass IPV and allow a person to control their partner. So when we're thinking of IPV, right, there's in law, we talk a lot about like sort of rationality. There are a lot of irrational reasons that a person might stay in a relationship with a person who is physically abusing them or abusing them in other kinds of ways, right? And these reasons are grounded in, for example, psychological connection. So an abusive partner uses a romantic attachment to solidify their bond with their victims. Emotional violence, there's a fear of violent retribution for displeasing an abusive partner. Economic abuse, if you have a limited access to economic resources, it's simply not a viable idea to leave the relationship. And this abuse includes interfering with employment, preventing access to finances, borrowing against a credit profile without consent, and sociocultural pressure. So women are in general, in American society, conditioned to attach personal value to having a partner. So being in an abusive relationship might be seen as being a better outcome than being single in this society, in a way that makes staying in that relationship seem beneficial. And so when you're looking at these outcomes or these features of intimate partner violence, the carceral approach stops making sense, right? So you can't use prison to remedy any of these issues. Something deeper has to be, there has to be sort of like a deeper intervention. And so this paper is part of a proposal that economic policy can be used as an IPV intervention that can facilitate a woman who is in the midst of an abusive relationship to have the option to like have the knowledge that she can safely pick up and leave, right? Like that is like kind of what I envision is the idea of like you just kind of get up and go in the sense of like having get out money, and to do this in abusive relationships. Because when you leave a relationship, especially a long-term one that involves cohabitation, you suddenly have many very significant expenses and have to account for how you're going to address them. And so thinking about how to address all of these different expenses could be the barrier between a person deciding to leave and deciding to stay. So you have to secure housing, you have to figure out how to get healthcare. If you have children, you have to find adequate childcare. You have to find access to affordable transportation, especially if you need to access different services in different parts of your area. And you need money for basic things. You need to get food, you need to get clothing, you need toiletries. And so whatever policy intervention like is designed for intimate partner violence has to address these immediate needs of people who are getting up and leaving an abusive relationship. So the thesis of the project as it stands is that there are features of tax policy that are designed, has been designed in the patriarchal society of the United States that contain certain mutable features. So mutable being like they can be changed, right? They're not set in stone. They're not dictated by nature. They're just things. They're just a way that people decided to do things at some point, right? So they contain certain mutable features that undermine women's ability to maintain economic autonomy when they enter long-term relationships, and therefore undermine their ability to exit abusive relationship conditions. And so the argument is that tax policies that like sort of group women in non-severable economic units with their partners to measure their income undermine their autonomy in relationships in two ways. So I consider joint taxation, which has been explored very broadly in tax literature, which obscures women's relative economic position from a potential state intervener. So how does the state know that the woman in the relationship has absolutely no access to money or like just has no independent economic resources if they only consider her in joint partnership with her husband? And second, this relates to, I guess, my most recent project, which is the means-tested income assistance enshrines codependence on spouses and limits access to state-based financial assistance upon exit. So if you are married to somebody who is abusive and you get up and leave, and suddenly you need assistance, you need to use the EITC. The question is, how do you access those resources without having to cooperate with your abuser, which could put you in danger again, right? So having these sort of inextricable links within the tax law between spouses increases women's risk if they have to leave an abusive relationship. So my proposal for, or at least the proposal as it stands right now, is to reform these features in tax policy. Reforming these features in tax policy can improve women's independent economic security from cradle to grave. This means treating women as separate economic units from their spouses or their partners, phasing out market employment as a test of moral desert for government assistance, and increasing direct access to state assistance, and decreasing government reliance on non-state private interveners. And so the paper, as it develops, will look at these interventions as a way of creating the kind of environment where an abusive person has a harder time using women's, I guess, depressed economic status as a tool to keep her in the relationship. So basically, the idea is that we potentially can't, intervene to make society think of women and men as equal, right? So we can't intervene at the level of the sociocultural pressure around relationships, but we can intervene at the level of economic access. So this policy kind of says, we possibly can't fix psychological harm, emotional harm, or mental or other certain features of harm, but we can intervene through economic resources in a way that allows women to know, right, to have the kind of intrinsic knowledge that they are not bound to the person who is abusing them simply because they have no other access to financial resources. So hopefully that puts me within time, and that is the end of my presentation. I'm really grateful to all of you for your questions, and I will leave it to Leandra to start the queue.